Well, that's a difficult song to listen to, I think. We talked about this song, Brad and I did. Charm was out of town this past week in Georgia, and so Brad and I met and we talked about this song. And, I didn't mention this last week after the General Conference decision and just doubling down on the ban on LGBTQ marriage and ordination. And it left a lot of people angry, for sure. But it also left a lot of people just sort of in this state of despair and disheartenment. Is disheartenment a word? It left us disheartened. And it occurred to me that there's something that I think we have to recognize sometimes in our challenges, and when things just literally don't go the way we'd hoped they would go, when things sort of slam us into a wall we didn't even see there, that there's a place for us simply to just express how upset we are, just how wrong this all feels. The Old Testament word for this was lament. And it's that feeling of being at the church and the master's gone. It's that feeling of being in our sanctuary, in our personal sacred space, and feeling like the sacred is gone. And it's important, I think, that we recognize that reality. And when it comes, not to run from it or not to defend against it, but just to allow the grief to be there. It's unfortunate, it's difficult, it's painful, it's a reality. And yet it's not the final answer, right? We know that, but it's painful. As I mentioned last week, it's painful in different ways for many of us. We're beginning this season of Lent with this theme, This Is Us. And it was a theme that all of us got together, all the staff got together, and we thought about what should be the next theme for where we are for this season of Lent, 6 weeks as we make our way to Easter. And so the theme came up, This Is Us. We went through a lot of different options, but we came with This Is Us. And the irony of that statement had not occurred to us when we were coming up with this theme, of course. We knew that General Conference would be meeting, but the irony of this sort of smacks you in the face. Who are we then in response to this? And so we have this theme of the first Sunday in Lent is We Proclaim. Now you can go online on the church's website and you can see this is one of those seasons, twice a year, all of the different worship services sort of agree to the singular theme that the whole church is going to pursue. And we'll do it in our own sort of reflective ways, our own distinctive voices and such. But we're going to play with this theme together, which means, as a side note, if you're of a mind to do it, you can show up at 8:30, attend Disciple Church, 9:30, go to the gathering or the traditional or the sanctuary service, and then 11:11 come here, and you'll see 3 different takes on the same theme. How often do you get a chance to do that? Every Sunday. So anyway, so I invite you to do that. If it'd be interesting. But our theme is This Is Us, and this first Sunday, as we begin this, we start with this idea of as a people of God, as a people in the world who represent the kingdom of God or the kingdom of God. One of the things that's a part of who we are is this idea of proclaiming, and of course. The text which was read, Brian, thank you for reading that so well. You can read every Sunday if you like. Who? Oh, Todd, you read. Brian, never mind. You guys, you read. No, what I remember is somebody read well, so there you go. Okay, I'm safe. Whew, okay. Anyway, you guys look so much alike, minus the glasses. So, but that text is at the end of every gospel in a different way, right? There's that sort of commissioning is present in all 4 of the gospels. Even in the Gospel of John, which is such a distinctive and strange, mystical kind of gospel, there's still this idea that was part of the early church, because these gospels were written anywhere from 40 or 50 years after Jesus' death to 100, maybe even 110 years. So these gospels represent the early community and its sense of outreach. So here is this sort of proclamation, this sort of commissioning to go out and proclaim in the world. And typically we think of this as sort of an evangelism. I was associate minister at several churches before I traveled for 20 years outside the local church. I was associate minister at several different churches. And at each one, because I was sort of like the general associate, I was minister of evangelism. which always was an interesting thing because I remember as a kid growing, as a teenager and a young adult in the Bible church and in Child Evangelism Fellowship. Anybody in here even know what I'm talking about, Child Evangelism Fellowship? Yes, a couple of you do know that, yes. So even then, as that, I knew what it meant to be an evangelist, and honestly, if I confess, you would not find it surprising that I have been on the corner with a megaphone myself. None of you are surprised that I did that. And I'll talk about why I did that in a little bit. But that was evangelism to me, right? Evangelism was me telling you, or at least you in general, the universal you, where you were missing the boat, where you needed to turn things around quick or you'd be burning in hell, and I'm here to save you. Not me, but God, but me because I'm chosen. I'm here to save you from that end, that desperate, terrible ending. And, of course, the interesting thing was nobody ever paid attention to me, right? It was I stood there and I yelled through that megaphone, but nobody ever really stopped and came over and said, oh, yeah, I need that. Come to think of it, I need that right now. So what is it about proclamation that we're supposed to be about? So I'm going to invite you to do something here for a couple of quick minutes. And it's what I want to suggest to you is that proclaiming is less about talking at and more about inviting into something. So I just want you to take a minute to do this little exercise for fun. I hope you have fun with it. I want you to turn to the person next to you or behind you or in front of you, and I want you to ask them, just one-on-one, ask them what is something they're really excited about, something they're really into in their life. It may be cooking, it may be making model planes, it may be walking your dog every day as your private moment of respite. Whatever it is, I want you to think about something you're into. Turn to the person next to you and you ask them, tell me about what it is you're into and why. And then that person can turn around and ask you the same thing. I'm going to give you 5 minutes. That's all you got. Maybe less. That's a long time. You're going to have to look at each other. If I can catch your attention real quick. Wait a minute, wait. Excuse me. I'm looking around and I'm seeing something that already I should have corrected. Don't turn to your spouse. Oh, don't turn to your best friend there, okay, or your child. Turn to somebody else. All right, go on. Y'all already did it? You've already figured it out? Already figured that out? Yeah. Okay. So ask the next question. When you've asked why you're into it, then ask for an example of where that's happened or a little more clarification. Does that make sense?
We may have missed the second question. We're still on the first one.
So the first one is, what are you into?
Okay.
And why?
Okay. Why?
And why?
Okay.
And then if that doesn't take very long, then ask another question. You want to know more about this thing that they're into. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Tom? Hey, Tom. What are you into?
Well, that's a good question. I'm always into a little golf.
All right.
I'm into like our discussions.
Into our discussion?
Into our
So tell me why you're into golf. Yeah? Because you're always playing with somebody.
I won't play alone.
Okay. Yeah.
What are you into?
I'm into ukulele. I love it.
I'm into our meetings. I'm into our little talks with Gene on Wednesday.
Good.
I find them interesting. I find our talks on Monday.
Yep. I'm into a book group on Monday morning that I'm with. because these are guys that I feel I can be completely honest with. Guys and girls. Yeah, so I mean, I can be as honest as a record. Nobody's going to come in there and say, judge me, or I don't have to risk being out. You know, I can be honest with who I am. Yeah.
Oh, and I'm also into my dog. I'm also into my kid.
Well, that's easy. All right, take just another minute. So I don't know what you discovered. I hope you discovered something that you hadn't heard before or didn't know before. But even more than that, I hope you discovered something interesting. I hope you discovered something that you found curious and you wanted to know a little bit more about. There's this idea of proclaiming. If you look up the root words, because I've always struggled with, I remember in the church, I've always struggled with this idea, how do you witness your faith? As though that's kind of what we're supposed to be doing. And really, this idea of proclaim to me is such a profound word. If you look at the root words, it means to clear a path. It means to simply make a way or clear a path. We think of proclaiming as everybody talking at you, right? You remember that Midnight Cowboy song? Everybody's talking at me. I can't hear a word they're saying, only the echoes of my mind. Wow, 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 wow. Have you ever watched Harry Nilsson's video? That's the most embarrassing video. It's like, dude, you're just standing there going, wow, wow. But that song, I've always heard that song, and I thought, wait a minute, that's so much of what preaching feels like sometimes, and hopefully not my preaching, but certainly what evangelism sometimes feels like. It feels like I'm telling you what you need to know. And of course, in here, what I hope that you experience is more this invitation to think about things, more this, if anything, just something you hadn't thought of before, a different way of looking at something that might send you off asking more questions and maybe disagreeing with me, but now you're more interested, you're asking questions. Generally, what I'm trying to do in here is I'm trying to talk about what I'm into. This is kind of what I'm into. One of the things, at least in terms of worship, in terms of being here in 1111, of being at this church. So proclaiming has more to do with making a way, clearing a path. It's interesting, I was reading this article from the New York Times last week. And in the New York Times it says, this article by, let's see if I can find his name here. It was Arthur Brooks. And some of you might have read some of his stuff. Arthur Brooks is an interesting writer, and he's part of a think tank in Washington, D.C. He says, political scientists have been saying that our nation is more polarized than it has ever been since any time since the Civil War. 1 in 6 Americans has stopped talking to a family member or a close friend because of the 2016 election. Millions of people organize their social lives and their news exposure along ideological lines to avoid people with opposing viewpoints. What's the problem here? Right? It used to be we could line up along political issues, but even now we don't line up along political issues, we line up along ideological issues. And those become so difficult to really pin down in terms of pragmatic life, in terms of our day-to-day experiences. I read about this article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that called this idea motive attribution asymmetry. Motive attribution asymmetry. Do you know what that means? No, I know. I have no idea. What is that? So it's this idea that the love, the assumption that your ideology is based on your love, because you're a good person, right? I'm a good person. My ideology is based on my love. But yet, at the same time, your opponent's is therefore based in hate. So there's this asymmetry. The research found that the average Republican and the average Democrat today suffer from a level of motive attribution asymmetry that is comparable with that of Palestinians and Israelis. The same thing was happening on the General Conference floor last week in St. Louis. There was this motive attribution asymmetry. You could see all of the discussions. I don't know how many of you watched any of it online, but you could see there were no conversations, there were no discussions, there wasn't even debate. There was simply everyone talking at one another, arguing their point. To some point, which it became a noxious brew of anger and disgust. And that's one of the things that Arthur suggests in this. Arthur Brooks, he says that this motive attribution asymmetry, right? Our assumption of being right or love or we're good people and the assumption that they are therefore bad people, it creates something that's not, it's not a, what's the word I'm looking for? I didn't write it down, so I'm wondering why I didn't write this word down. It's not an insensitivity that we're experiencing from one another. It's not an indecency or disconnect in that way. It is literally, in the words of Arthur Schopenhauer, contempt. We are experiencing a level of contempt because of this asymmetry. So that when we look at the other that represents an ideological opposite, we don't look at this other person from a perspective of another human being. We literally look at them from a perspective of contempt. This unsullied conviction of the worthlessness of another. And that may seem strong in here because we're pretty reflective people in here. We're pretty self-critical people in here. And yet if we look at our culture is completely overwhelmed with this understanding of one another, with this context of contempt. And what happens is, part of the reason why we find ourselves more and more embedded in this is because of an addictive process, right? The more that we associate with our ideological base, our tribes, the people who think like us, the more we find ourselves reinforcing our own way of thinking, these echo chambers. So that we have to explore ways to literally break from an addiction that we have with this ideological base. And the addiction is there because of basic chemistry. Our basic chemistry around fear, flight, or freezing. We find ourselves frozen in these positions. We find ourselves afraid in context of communications with others. We find ourselves wanting to run away from these confrontations. And sometimes we find ourselves simply anxious. And here's the interesting thing. Fear, anger, distress, worry, anxiety, all of these emotions trigger the same chemicals in our body. So that after time, we are still reinforcing these contemptuous sort of breaks that we have with others. According to the American Psychological Association, the feeling of rejection so often experienced after being treated with shame or treated with insults results in this anxiety and depression, and it not only damages the contemptuous person, not only damages the one who's been insulted or who's been denied, but it also damages the one who's projecting the contempt, and that's the interesting thing. It's reinforcing on both sides. I remember listening last week to somebody who was writing in the Facebook, and they had said something to the effect of, now everybody's hurting on all sides of this issue. And I want to say that while that's true, what's not being recognized is why people are hurting and how they're hurting. We assume that they're hurting because they have a rigid stance or a deeply emotional stance to one position on the subject of